Everything you know about when humans arrived in America is wrong. Scientists just found human footprints that are 23,000 years old, 10,000 years earlier than we thought possible. These aren't just any footprints. They show children playing in mud while giant sloths and mammoths walked nearby. This isn't fiction. This isn't speculation. This is the story hidden within real human footprints discovered at White Sands National Park in New Mexico that completely shatters our understanding of human history. And it raises questions that will blow your mind. What if humans were in America far earlier than even these footprints suggest? What if there were entire forgotten civilizations that thrived and vanished without a trace? What if the stories of lost worlds that authors like Graham Hancock have promoted actually contain fragments of truth? What if ancient myths about giants and monster slayers are coded memories of real human encounters with megafauna? In the next 30 minutes, we're diving deep into the evidence, the controversies, and the mind-bending implications of these ancient footprints. We'll explore not just what we know, but what might be possible, from coastal migrations to vanished settlements, now submerged beneath rising seas, from forgotten technologies to catastrophes that may have wiped entire populations from the archaeological record. For decades, the scientific consensus held that humans didn't arrive in North America until around 13,000 years ago, just as the last ice age was ending. These pioneers were thought to be the bearers of the Clovis culture, named after their distinctive stone tools, first found near Clovis, New Mexico. It was a neat, tidy theory that explained human migration into the Americas. But in the soft gypsum soils of White Sands National Park, that narrative literally left footprints that upend everything we thought we knew. The tracks tell an astonishing story. Humans were here, walking alongside extinct Ice Age giants, some 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, during the height of the last Ice Age, when massive glaciers covered much of North America, almost 10,000 years earlier than the Clovis timeline allows. How did they get here when ice sheets should have blocked their path? How did they survive in a landscape dominated by megafauna and extreme climate? And perhaps most intriguingly, what happened to them? Did they die out? Did they become the ancestors of Native Americans? Or is their story far more complex than we've imagined? These fossilized footprints force us to question everything about human history in the Americas. They challenge our understanding of migration, of human resilience, and of our shared past. And they open the door to a forgotten chapter of human history that might be far richer and more fascinating than we ever dreamed. In the mud of an ancient lakebed, children played, teenagers carried toddlers, and adults tracked giant sloths. Their footprints, frozen in time for over 20,000 years, are now speaking to us, if we're willing to listen. The discovery at White Sands wasn't just another archaeological find. It was an earthquake in our understanding of human prehistory. Announced in 2021, researchers identified 61 human footprints preserved in 7 layers of sediment along the shores of what was once Lake Otero, now a vast expanse of white gypsum dunes. Using radiocarbon dating on seeds found in the same layers as the footprints, scientists determined these people walked here between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. The implications are staggering. These dates place humans in North America during the last glacial maximum, the coldest, harshest period of the Ice Age, when massive ice sheets covered much of the northern continent. According to the old theories, this should have been impossible. At first, many scientists were skeptical. Could the dating be wrong? Maybe the seeds had absorbed older carbon from the lake water, skewing the results. This is a known phenomenon called the reservoir effect. But the White Sands team wasn't satisfied with a single line of evidence. They returned and applied multiple dating methods, optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains in the sediment, and additional radiocarbon dating on terrestrial pollen from the same layers. The results? All the dating methods converged on the same time frame, 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. The evidence was becoming harder and harder to dismiss. What makes these footprints so extraordinary isn't just their age, but what they reveal about daily life. These aren't just static artifacts like stone tools or bones. They capture moments in time. A teenager carrying a toddler on a long journey across muddy ground, their footprints intermingled and preserved for millennia. Children playing at the water's edge. Most remarkably, human footprints following those of a giant ground sloth, suggesting a human was stalking this massive beast. In one poignant trackway, a woman or adolescent carried a child across the muddy lake shore, put the child down for a few steps, picked them up again, and continued on. Their path later crossed by a mammoth that didn't change its course, suggesting these ancient giants were accustomed to human presence. These aren't just scientific data points, they're glimpses into the lives of people who lived and breathed and walked and hunted at the edge of an ancient lake, at a time when conventional wisdom says they shouldn't have been there at all. But how did they get there? During the last glacial maximum, North America was very different from today. Massive ice sheets, the Laurentide to the east and the Cordilleran to the west, covered much of Canada and the northern United States, forming an impenetrable barrier of ice. The traditional theory held that humans migrated from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge, a strip of land connecting Siberia and Alaska that was exposed during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower. From there, the theory suggested, they traveled south through an ice-free corridor between the ice sheets. But during the last glacial maximum, this corridor simply didn't exist. The ice sheets merged, creating a solid wall of ice from the Atlantic to the Pacific. If humans were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they didn't come through this route, at least not when conventional wisdom says they did. So how did they get here? One compelling theory is the Pacific coastal route. Rather than traveling inland, early Americans might have skirted the coastline by boat, following the shoreline from Alaska all the way down to South America. This coastal migration would have been possible even during the height of the Ice Age, as parts of the Pacific coast remained ice-free. This theory has gained support in recent years, especially as evidence mounts for early human seafaring capabilities. We know humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, a journey that would have required crossing open water. By 23,000 years ago, humans had developed watercraft technology sufficiently advanced to navigate coastal waters, following what researchers call the kelp highway, coastal kelp forest ecosystems rich in marine resources that could sustain migrating populations. But here's where the mystery deepens. If these early Americans arrived via the coast, how did they end up in New Mexico, hundreds of miles inland? They must have followed rivers, valleys, and mountain passes, moving ever deeper into the continent. This wasn't accidental wandering. It required purposeful exploration, knowledge of landscapes, and remarkable adaptability to new environments. And the White Sands footprints tell us they succeeded. Not only did they reach inland New Mexico, but they thrived there, establishing a presence that lasted generations. The environment these early Americans encountered was drastically different from today's arid desert. During the last glacial maximum, White Sands was a lush wetland surrounding a large lake. The climate was cooler and less arid, supporting vast grasslands rather than desert. This verdant landscape attracted an array of Pleistocene megafauna, Columbian mammoths, Harlan's giant ground sloths, ancient camels, and bison roamed the shores of Lake Otero. These in turn attracted predators. Dire wolves and American lions stalked the wetlands, and humans joined this complex ecosystem, not as outsiders, but as integral parts of it. The footprints reveal fascinating interactions. One set of human prints appears to follow a sloth's track, suggesting a human was tracking or hunting this massive creature. The sloth's prints show it pausing and turning, perhaps sensing the humans. This wasn't some chance encounter. It was a deliberate interaction between predator and prey. How did these early Americans survive in this environment? They were hunter-gatherers, adept at exploiting diverse resources. The wetland environment would have provided abundant plant foods, small game, and fish. The presence of megafauna offered opportunities for hunting or scavenging large game. But taking down a mammoth or a giant sloth would have required sophisticated hunting techniques and cooperation among multiple hunters. The footprints also tell us about social structure. Many of the tracks belong to teenagers and children, with fewer adult prints. This suggests a division of labor. Perhaps adults were off hunting or performing skilled tasks, while younger members gathered resources or played near the lake. The presence of so many children's footprints indicates this wasn't just a temporary hunting camp, but a place where families lived and children were raised. These weren't just survivors clinging to existence in a harsh world. They were communities adapting and thriving in their environment. But the White Sands footprints raise a profound question. What happened to these early Americans? If humans were in North America 10,000 years before the Clovis culture, where are their descendants? Where are their artifacts, their settlements, their burials? Several possibilities exist. Perhaps these early populations remained small and isolated, leaving minimal archaeological traces. Maybe they died out during subsequent climate changes as the Ice Age waned. Or perhaps they were absorbed into later waves of migration, their genetic and cultural contributions diluted but not entirely lost. The archaeological record between 23,000 and 13,000 years ago is sparse, creating what scientists call a ghost population, people whose existence we can infer but whose material culture largely eludes us. Some sites offer tantalizing hints. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania has yielded artifacts possibly as old as 19,000 years. Bluefish Caves in Yukon contains animal bones with cut marks dating to around 24,000 years ago. But these sites are few and far between, and many remain controversial within the archaeological community. The White Sands footprints are different. They provide unequivocal evidence of human presence that cannot be dismissed as natural phenomena or misinterpreted artifacts. One intriguing possibility is that evidence of these early Americans lies submerged beneath the oceans. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were up to 400 feet lower than today, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. If early migrations followed coastlines, their camps and settlements would have been established near prehistoric shorelines, now hundreds of feet underwater and miles from modern coasts. What secrets might lie preserved in these submerged landscapes? Another possibility is that glacial action and post-glacial floods destroyed or deeply buried evidence of early occupation. The massive ice sheets scoured the landscape as they advanced and retreated, while catastrophic floods, like the Missoula floods that swept across the Pacific Northwest, could have obliterated entire settlements. The White Sands footprints survived because they were quickly buried by lake sediments and preserved in an area untouched by glaciers or major floods. How many other traces of early Americans have been lost to these geological processes? The genetic evidence adds another layer to this mystery. DNA studies of modern and ancient Native Americans suggest that virtually all indigenous peoples of the Americas descend from a single founding population that was isolated in Beringia, the region encompassing eastern Siberia and western Alaska, during the last glacial maximum. According to genetic models, this population expanded southward only after the ice sheets began to retreat, around 17,000 to 16,000 years ago. But there are hints of complexity in the genetic record. Some indigenous groups in South America carry a small genetic signature known as population Y, indicating distant connections to Australasian populations. This could represent an earlier migration wave that left only a faint genetic trace in modern populations. If the White Sands people represented an earlier migration, were they completely replaced by later arrivals? Or did they contribute in small ways to the genetic makeup of subsequent populations? Without ancient DNA from human remains dating to this period, we can only speculate. What we do know is that these early Americans were fully modern humans, cognitively identical to ourselves. They weren't primitive in any meaningful sense. They were innovative, adaptable people who successfully colonized a new continent during the harshest period of the Ice Age. This required sophisticated knowledge of environments, advanced hunting and gathering techniques, and social cooperation. They may have had technologies that haven't survived in the archaeological record. Clothing tailored from animal hides, tools made from wood or bone, woven baskets, cordage, and perhaps even watercraft. Many traditional technologies leave no archaeological trace unless preserved in extraordinary circumstances like extreme cold, extreme dryness, or oxygen-free environments. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found extensive remains of their material culture doesn't mean it didn't exist. The White Sands footprints are extraordinary, but they're not unique. Around the world, archaeological discoveries are pushing back the dates of human migration and challenging established narratives. In Australia, evidence from Madjed Bebe rock shelter indicates human presence at least 65,000 years ago, some 15,000 years earlier than previously thought. This discovery has implications not just for Australian prehistory, but for human migration capabilities, suggesting early seafaring much earlier than once believed. In the Americas, other pre-Clovis sites have gradually eroded the Clovis first paradigm. Monteverde in Chile, dated to around 14,500 years ago, proved humans had reached South America well before Clovis. Chiquihuit Cave in Mexico yielded stone tools potentially as old as 26,000 to 30,000 years, though this remains controversial. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, gradually revealing a picture of human prehistory far more complex and dynamic than previously imagined. The peopling of the Americas wasn't a single event, but a process spanning thousands of years, involving multiple migration waves, different routes, and diverse adaptations to new environments. And the White Sands footprints occupy a special place in this evolving narrative. Unlike stone tools or bones, which can sometimes be ambiguous, footprints are direct evidence of human presence, moments of daily life preserved for millennia. They connect us intimately with these ancient people, allowing us to literally walk in their footsteps across the vast gulfs of time. This brings us to perhaps the most intriguing question of all. Could these discoveries lend credence to indigenous oral traditions that speak of great antiquity on the land? Many Native American traditions describe their people as having been present on their lands since time immemorial. These aren't specific timelines in a Western sense, but they do convey a sense of deep time and connection to place that transcends conventional archaeological timelines. Some traditions describe giants or monster-like creatures that once roamed the land, beings that could conceivably represent memories of Ice Age megafauna. Others tell of great migrations, climatic changes, or catastrophic events that reshaped the landscape, echoing real environmental shifts at the end of the Pleistocene. While we must be careful not to interpret oral traditions too literally or impose scientific frameworks upon them, it's worth considering that these stories might encode distant memories of real events and experiences passed down through countless generations. The discovery at White Sands affirms that indigenous peoples have indeed been present in the Americas far longer than Western science once acknowledged. In this convergence of science and traditional knowledge, there may be opportunities for collaboration and mutual insight. This is where the work of controversial authors like Graham Hancock becomes intriguing. While mainstream archaeology has dismissed many of his claims about advanced prehistoric civilizations, findings like the White Sands footprints do force us to admit that our timeline of human presence in the Americas was wrong. If we were off by 10,000 years, what else might we be missing? Some Native American traditions describe their ancestors emerging from underground worlds, surviving great floods, or interacting with powerful beings. These are often dismissed as purely mythological, but could they contain kernels of historical truth? Could stories of emergence from underground refer to survival in caves during catastrophic climate events? Could flood myths preserve memories of post-glacial sea level rise that drowned coastal settlements? Could legends of giant beings or monsters reflect actual encounters with now extinct megafauna? The Hopi speak of previous worlds or epochs of humanity that were destroyed by various catastrophes. The Navajo have stories of earlier peoples who possessed powerful knowledge. Many traditions across North and South America describe ancestors who were present since the beginning of time. While we shouldn't take these as literal historical accounts, they do align with a pattern of human presence far deeper than previously recognized. There's a middle ground between rejecting these traditions entirely and claiming they prove the existence of advanced prehistoric civilizations. Perhaps these stories preserve, in symbolic form, memories of migrations, climate shifts, ecological changes, and interactions with animals that actually occurred, not 5,000 years ago, but 15,000, 20,000, or even 25,000 years ago. Indigenous perspectives on landscape, ecology, and human-environment relationships could inform archaeological interpretations, while archaeological discoveries might provide new contexts for understanding oral traditions. This isn't about validating one knowledge system with another, but recognizing the value of multiple ways of knowing the past. The White Sands footprints remind us that the human story in the Americas is still being written, or rather, rewritten. Every new discovery has the potential to reshape our understanding, to challenge our assumptions, and to reveal forgotten chapters of our shared past. And there is still so much we don't know. Who were these early Americans? Where exactly did they come from? What routes did they follow? What technologies did they possess? What languages did they speak? What spiritual beliefs guided their understanding of the world? Did they survive to become ancestors of later populations? Or did their lineages end in the depths of the Ice Age? These questions aren't just academic puzzles. They speak to fundamental aspects of the human experience. They're about resilience in the face of environmental challenges, about exploration and adaptation, about the deep roots of cultural diversity in the Americas. The dating of the White Sands footprints to 21,000 to 23,000 years ago places humans in North America during the last glacial maximum, the coldest, harshest period of the Ice Age. This challenges not just when humans arrived, but how they got here and how they survived. Traditional models suggested humans couldn't have entered North America during this period because massive ice sheets formed an impenetrable barrier across northern latitudes. If the ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets wasn't open, how did they get here? One compelling possibility is the coastal migration route. Even during the last glacial maximum, parts of the Pacific coast remained ice-free. Early Americans might have traveled by boat, following the coastline southward. They would have found abundant marine resources in coastal ecosystems, what researchers call the kelp highway. This wasn't just possible. We know humans had already demonstrated remarkable seafaring capabilities by this time. The settlement of Australia, at least 65,000 years ago, required crossing open water. By 23,000 years ago, humans had developed watercraft and navigational knowledge sufficient for coastal voyages. But let's push this idea further into speculative territory. What if early humans didn't just hug the coastline but ventured far out to sea? What if they possessed seafaring technologies and navigational knowledge far beyond what we've credited them with? We know that Polynesian sailors crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using sophisticated navigation techniques based on stars, currents, wind patterns, and animal behavior. They accomplished this with technology that would seem primitive by modern standards. Outrigger canoes and knowledge passed through oral tradition. Is it so implausible that earlier maritime cultures could have achieved similar feats? What if the peopling of the Americas wasn't just a gradual crawl along coastlines, but included deliberate ocean voyages? The Pacific's currents and wind patterns could have facilitated travel from Asia to the Americas, either intentionally or accidentally, when fishing vessels were blown off course. Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl demonstrated with his Kon-Tiki expedition that even a simple balsa raft could cross the Pacific using only the currents. If unintentional crossings were possible with minimal technology, intentional ones with more sophisticated craft and navigation aren't out of the question. If such maritime capabilities existed, the implications are profound. Early humans might have established contact between continents far earlier than we've imagined. They might have created trading networks spanning thousands of miles. They might have possessed detailed knowledge of distant lands preserved in oral traditions. Of course, we have no physical evidence of advanced boats or navigation tools from 23,000 years ago. Any wooden vessels or other organic materials would have decomposed long ago. But the fact that humans reached Australia 65,000 years ago and populated remote Pacific islands much later demonstrates that seafaring is deeply embedded in human capabilities. The absence of physical evidence doesn't mean these capabilities didn't exist, especially when we consider how little of the archaeological record survives after tens of thousands of years. From coastal entry points, these early pioneers could have followed rivers inland, eventually reaching places like New Mexico. This wasn't random wandering. It required intentional exploration, environmental knowledge, and sophisticated wayfinding abilities. Another possibility is that humans entered North America even earlier, during a warm period before the last glacial maximum when the ice-free corridor was open. They might have established populations south of the ice sheets that persisted through the glacial period, becoming the people who left footprints at White Sands. This scenario would push human arrival even further back in time, perhaps to 30,000 years ago or more. While direct evidence for this is currently limited, it remains a plausible hypothesis worth investigating. The White Sands footprints challenge us to think bigger and look harder for evidence of early Americans. They suggest we've been missing significant chapters of human history in the Americas, perhaps because we weren't looking in the right places or with the right methods. Many potential early sites might now be submerged beneath the oceans. During the Ice Age, sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. If early migrations followed coastlines, their settlements would have been established near prehistoric shorelines, now underwater. Underwater archaeology is beginning to explore these submerged landscapes, and future discoveries could revolutionize our understanding of early American prehistory. Similarly, areas that were once ice-free refuges during the last glacial maximum might hold evidence of human occupation that has yet to be discovered. The White Sands footprints also raise fascinating questions about human-megafauna interactions. These early Americans shared their environment with Columbian mammoths, giant ground sloths, ancient camels, and other Ice Age giants. The trackways show humans in close proximity to these animals, in one case, apparently stalking a giant sloth. Were these early Americans hunting megafauna? Did they contribute to the eventual extinction of these species? Or did they develop sustainable relationships with these animals over thousands of years? But let's go even further. What if humans didn't just hunt these creatures, but had deeper relationships with them? Could early Americans have partially domesticated some megafauna species? We know wolves were in the process of domestication into dogs around 23,000 years ago in Siberia. Is it possible that some groups had proto-domesticated mammoths or ground sloths for labor or protection? Imagine settlements where specific megafauna were not just tolerated, but integrated into human life. Mammoths cleared paths or helped move heavy objects, while humans provided protection from predators. It sounds fantastic, but domestication isn't a binary switch. It's a spectrum of relationships. The footprints at White Sands already show us that humans and mammoths were comfortable in close proximity. The mammoth that crossed the human tracks didn't alter its course, suggesting these weren't frightening predators, but familiar presences in the landscape. Of course, there's no direct evidence of domestication of American megafauna. No harnesses, no corrals, no selective breeding. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially for perishable technologies that wouldn't survive millennia in the archaeological record. If such relationships existed, they would have been lost when these magnificent creatures went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. A technology and knowledge base completely erased from human experience. One trackway shows a woman or adolescent carrying a child across the muddy lake shore, their path later crossed by a mammoth that doesn't alter its course. This suggests these giant animals were accustomed to human presence. They weren't fleeing in terror at the scent of humans. Perhaps these early Americans were not newcomers to the landscape, but had been coexisting with megafauna for generations by the time they left these footprints. This would push human arrival back even further, allowing time for animals to become habituated to human presence. The environmental context of the White Sands footprints is crucial for understanding how these early Americans survived. During the last glacial maximum, what is now an arid desert was a lush wetland surrounding a large lake. The cooler, moister climate supported grasslands that attracted abundant wildlife. These early Americans weren't struggling to survive in a frozen wasteland. They were exploiting a rich ecological niche. The wetland environment would have provided diverse plant foods, fish, and small game, while the surrounding grasslands supported large herbivores that could be hunted. But what if they possessed knowledge and technologies far more sophisticated than we've imagined? We assume their survival required only simple stone tools and basic perishable technologies. But what if they had developed complex hunting strategies, specialized tools, or knowledge systems that would seem advanced even by today's standards? Consider celestial navigation. We know that hunter-gatherers around the world developed intricate knowledge of star patterns for navigation and timekeeping. What if these early Americans had mapped the night sky in ways that allowed precise prediction of seasonal changes and animal migrations? What if they understood astronomical cycles that modern science only rediscovered in recent centuries? Or consider pharmacology. Indigenous peoples across the Americas have identified thousands of medicinal plants and their specific applications. This knowledge didn't appear overnight. It accumulated over generations of careful observation and experimentation. The earliest Americans might have carried extensive medical knowledge that would impress modern physicians, identifying antibiotics, painkillers, and treatments for specific conditions millennia before Western medicine. What about climatology? People who depend directly on natural cycles develop acute sensitivity to subtle environmental changes. These early Americans might have recognized patterns in climate fluctuations that allowed them to predict droughts, floods, or temperature shifts years in advance, a capability that would seem almost supernatural to outsiders, but was based on multi-generational observation of natural indicators. We have no physical evidence for these specific capabilities, of course. But it's entirely plausible that these early Americans possessed intellectual technologies, systems of knowledge, observation, and prediction that were highly sophisticated. Their technological advancement might have been expressed not in material artifacts that survive archaeological time, but in knowledge systems preserved through oral tradition and practical application. Even their material technology might have been more advanced than we assume. Simple stone tools, along with perishable technologies like wooden spears, cordage, baskets, and tailored clothing, would have been sufficient for basic survival. But they might also have developed specialized tools optimized for specific prey or environments, techniques for preserving food through harsh seasons, or methods of shelter construction that left no trace after millennia. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was preserved in oral tradition, passed from generation to generation through stories, songs, and direct teaching. The accumulated environmental wisdom of a community would have been its most valuable resource, more important than any physical tool. The presence of children's footprints at White Sands suggests this wasn't just a temporary hunting camp, but a place where families lived and children were raised. The tracks indicate children playing, teenagers carrying toddlers, adults going about daily tasks. This was a community, not just a group of hunters passing through. These early Americans didn't just survive, they thrived, establishing a presence that lasted generations. The footprints occur in 7 distinct layers, spanning about 2,000 years of repeated human activity. This wasn't a one-time visit, but a sustained occupation of the region. Perhaps the most enigmatic question raised by the White Sands footprints is, what happened to these early Americans? If humans were in North America 10,000 years before the Clovis culture emerged, where are their descendants? Where are their artifacts, their settlements, their burials? Several possibilities exist. Perhaps these early populations remained small and isolated, leaving minimal archaeological traces. Maybe they died out during subsequent climate changes as the Ice Age waned. Or perhaps they were absorbed into later waves of migration, their genetic and cultural contributions diluted but not entirely lost. The archaeological record between 23,000 and 13,000 years ago is sparse, creating what scientists call a ghost population, people whose existence we can infer, but whose material culture largely eludes us. The White Sands footprints confirm these ghost populations were real, not just theoretical constructs. But here's where we can speculate more boldly. What if these early Americans weren't just scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, but achieved more complex societies than we've ever given them credit for? What if they developed settlements, technologies, and cultural innovations that have simply vanished from the archaeological record? Consider this. We know from other parts of the world that humans 23,000 years ago were creating sophisticated art, complex tools, and possibly even proto-writing systems. The cave paintings at Lascaux and other European sites show incredible artistic skill and symbolic thinking. Venus figurines and other portable art demonstrate abstract conceptualization. If European humans were this advanced, why not American ones? Imagine settlements along ancient lakeshores or coastlines, places where resources were abundant enough to support semi-permanent habitation. These people might have developed specialized tools for fishing or hunting specific animals. They might have created woven structures, boats, or sleds that would leave no trace after millennia. They might have had complex social organizations, spiritual practices, and oral traditions that encoded astronomical knowledge. Is it so far-fetched to imagine that some of these settlements grew beyond what we typically consider hunter-gatherer scale? Could some have achieved population densities and social complexities that approached what we might call civilization? The conventional answer is no. We have no evidence of agriculture, metallurgy, monumental architecture, or writing from this period in the Americas. But consider the constraints of preservation. Anything made of organic materials would have long since decayed. Any coastal settlements would now be hundreds of feet underwater due to rising sea levels. Any structures would have been buried by sediment, destroyed by glacial action, or eroded by thousands of years of exposure. What if catastrophic events, super eruptions, comet impacts, or rapid climate shifts wiped out these societies so completely that even oral histories couldn't survive? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a comet struck North America around 12,900 years ago, triggering sudden cooling and widespread fires. If true, such an event could have decimated populations and erased evidence of their achievements. Without ancient DNA from this period, we can't determine their genetic relationship to later Americans. Were they ancestors of Native Americans? Were they replaced by later arrivals? Or is the story more complex, involving multiple migrations, intermixing, and population turnovers? What we do know is that the conventional narrative of a single, late migration into an empty continent is no longer tenable. The Americas weren't a pristine wilderness awaiting the first human footprint 13,000 years ago. They had already felt human steps for at least 10,000 years before that. The implications extend beyond archaeology into our understanding of human-environment relationships. These early Americans were interacting with Ice Age ecosystems for thousands of years before the major extinctions of megafauna at the end of the Pleistocene. They weren't sudden invaders disrupting pristine ecosystems, but long-term participants in those systems. This challenges simplistic narratives about human impacts. The relationship between early humans and their environments was complex and varied. They weren't separate from nature, but integral parts of it, shaping and being shaped by the landscapes they inhabited. The White Sands footprints connect us intimately with these ancient people. We can see where a child jumped in puddles at the lake's edge, where a teenager carefully carried a toddler across muddy ground, where a hunter stalked a giant sloth. These aren't just scientific data points. They're glimpses into lived experiences, moments of daily life preserved for millennia. In those muddy impressions, we see ourselves reflected across the vast gulfs of time. These weren't alien beings, but people like us, with the same capacities for love, fear, curiosity, and wonder. They cared for their children, taught them survival skills, told them stories under star-filled skies. What stories did they tell? What did they believe about their world? How did they explain the massive animals they encountered, the changing seasons, the patterns of stars above? We may never know the specifics of their worldview, but we can be certain they made sense of their world through cultural frameworks as rich and complex as our own. When we look at a child's footprint preserved in ancient mud, we're looking at more than an archaeological curiosity. We're witnessing a moment in a life, a brief instant when a small foot pressed into soft earth and left an impression that would outlast the entire span of written history. The White Sands footprints challenge us not just scientifically, but philosophically. They remind us that human history is far deeper and more complex than we often acknowledge. They suggest that much of our past remains hidden, waiting to be discovered. And they hint at the possibility that conventional narratives might be upended by future discoveries we haven't yet imagined. What other evidence might be waiting beneath our feet, under ocean waters, or frozen in Arctic soils? What other chapters of human history have we missed or misinterpreted? The White Sands footprints aren't the end of the story. They're an invitation to look deeper, to question established narratives, and to embrace the complexity of the human journey. As we continue to explore and discover, we may find that the history of humans in the Americas, and indeed across the globe, is far richer, more diverse, and more fascinating than we ever imagined. The footprints at White Sands are just one chapter in a story that continues to unfold, with each new discovery adding depth and nuance to our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The human journey across time and space is a narrative still being written, and in the soft gypsum soils of White Sands, ancient footprints are helping us rewrite that story one step at a time. But perhaps the most profound implication of these ancient footprints isn't about the past at all. It's about the future. If humans 23,000 years ago were capable of crossing oceans, traversing icebound continents, and adapting to entirely new environments with Stone Age technology, what might we be capable of with our modern knowledge and tools? Those ancient pioneers remind us of the fundamental human capacity for exploration, adaptation, and resilience. They ventured into unknown territories not because it was easy, but because exploration is intrinsic to our nature. They face challenges we can barely imagine with creativity and determination. As we face our own global challenges, climate change, environmental degradation, social upheaval, these ancient footprints offer a perspective both humbling and empowering. Human beings have overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles before. We've adapted to dramatically changing environments. We've survived extinction-level events. The footprints at White Sands aren't just artifacts from a distant past. They're reminders of our capacity for resilience, our adaptability in the face of change, and our fundamental connection to each other across the spans of time and space. When a child played in the mud of an ancient lakeshore 23,000 years ago, they couldn't have known their footprints would one day tell their story. They couldn't have imagined that distant descendants would study those prints and wonder about the lives they led. But those footprints endured, preserved in the earth like messages in a bottle, waiting to be found and interpreted by curious minds millennia later. They remind us that our actions today leave impressions that will be interpreted by future generations. Footprints, both literal and metaphorical, that tell the story of who we were and what we valued. What footprints are we leaving behind? What will they tell the future about us? The ancient footprints of White Sands National Park are more than just archaeological curiosities. They're connections across time, reminding us that we're part of a human story that stretches back into the deepest past and forward into the unimaginable future. A story of exploration and adaptation, of curiosity and resilience, of looking beyond horizons and venturing into the unknown. a story written in footprints, one step at a time.